The importance of scale. Big data and its complex structure is often multi-scaled. So data science is the study of big data, typically with algorithms known as predictive models, which assign a probability to every possible observation or sample of the features. And the result is a probability distribution on a feature space, which is itself a vector space. For example, toss a fair coin and then toss it again. So we have four possibilities. Notice that possibility 2 and 3 has the same set, one heads, one tails, but different structure. In other words, the ordering is different. The probability doesn't reflect that. See, analytics are more than statistics. We assume expected values are finite, but the expected value and variance of a variable are statistics. We use statistics to explore data and build insights, but they have limited utility in addressing complex data because the structure of the data is so important. See, data science seeks to extract and predict structured information from large complex data sets. The goal is actionable information about the high variety underlying structure, the complex underlying structure of a set of big data. And we're going to start using this word, topology. It means the way in which constituent parts are interrelated or arranged. And therefore, big data has a complex topology. And we want actionable information or analytics about the complex topology, which means statistics are not necessarily analytics. Statistics are tools in data science, but rarely are goals. See, data science is far more than statistics. There's a theorem, for instance, Bayesian optimal classifier is the best possible classifier you could ever have. So let's look at an example. Here we have green is where y sub I is -1, and gray is where y sub I is equal to 1. And what we're looking at is samples x1 to xm of a feature, a variable x, and the responses are either plus or minus 1. And we're coloring the data based on the responses. So we have a distribution for the negatives, the -1 response, and we have a distribution for the positives, the responses of 1. So we can look at the cumulative distribution for the green, the negatives, and also for the gray, the positives. And we can use those to split up where we should predict things are gray or positive and where we should predict things are green or negative. But this assumes we know the distributions explicitly. This is why we don't use Bayesian optimal classifiers very often. Real-world classifiers have to learn probability distributions on hugely many variables and are far too complex to write down explicitly. Statistics means you tend to have to know something about a distribution. Maybe the distribution of the error is given, or a prior distribution. And that given distribution has to be humanly intelligible. A naive Bayes classifier uses large-scale assumptions to approximate these unknowable distributions, and we'll look at this as an algorithm. But big data tends to have information at many different scales with relationships between those scales. That is, the different scales in the data are important. See, big data tends to come from experiments that produce large amounts of data, have a large number of features or a large number of observations, high dimensional, and sample from a large number of highly diverse interdependent processes, high variety. And these kinds of systems are complex systems. Weather is a complex system. And a complex system often involves multiple scales. Big and small features are both important. Scale is important to understanding structure. Scale refers to dimensional relationships among the parts. A high variety structure often has many different scales. So for instance, we have proteins are at one scale, while human activity is at a different scale. But the protein is what causes the muscle cell to flex, which causes the person to move. Even common everyday phenomena tend to involve processes at different scales. The Earth is flat, well, at least locally. We use terms like flat field and straight road. But on a global scale, the Earth is round. In daily life, there are different structures at each of these multiple scales, and they all interact. For example, your phone's GPS would not be possible on a flat Earth. The scales that are important depend on the questions you want answers to. Indeed, data is often collected at a smaller scale in order to address correct questions at a larger scale. So proteomic data is collected at the scale of the proteins, but it contains information about human scale phenomena. That is, big data is often multi-scale, collected from multi-scale complex systems. Complex systems that feature interactions on one scale that can produce complex phenomena on another scale. And we call this emergence. And big data often attempts to model emergence. Letters are used to form words, or used to form sentences, or used to form paragraphs, so on and so forth. So the letters are the small scale, the document is the large scale, but a document's meaning or sentiment emerges from its multi-scale ensemble structure of letters forming words, forming sentences, forming paragraphs, forming so on and so forth. It's the structure of those constituent parts that's the meaningful information. Genotype on a small scale might be used to predict phenotype on a large scale. A pathogen at a small scale causes an epidemic. That's large scale. Individual agents implying collective behavior. Twitter, recommender systems, Facebook, social networks, economic activity, videos going viral. We exist because of emergence. Everything a human is and does is due to the activities of proteins inside each cell. But there's a big problem. Traditional math models are single scale. And often we call these descriptive models. Descriptive models tend to be related to data via a paradigm of the data is equal to the equation model plus the noise. Typically only a few variables, typically an equation involving only smooth differentiable functions, and the noise is assumed to explain how the data differs from the model. And noise assumptions then hide all lower scales. So the equation model is at the largest scale, and the noise encapsulates all other scales. For example, linear regression. Suppose we have a data set that can be represented by a straight line, y equals mx plus b. That's an equation model. X and y are the variables. M and b are the model parameters. The data is of the form y sub I equals mx sub I plus b plus r sub I, where the r sub I are the residuals, the amount by which the data differs from the model. The r sub I are independent trials of a random variable, capital R, which is the residual. Linear regression is on the scale of the x, y, m, and b. All smaller scales are noise. They're all inside the residual. The errors. No larger scales are considered. See, descriptive modeling hides smaller scales. The moon orbiting the Earth, that's the two-body problem, is on the scale of thousands of miles for huge masses. Even perturbations. The Earth is not quite spherical, for instance, but even that's on the scale or slightly smaller than the scale of the Earth-Moon two-body problem itself. We don't need to know the address of every person on Earth in order to solve the Earth-Moon two-body problem. And that's why we can use differentiability. The largest scale modeled locally by a single linear transformation, all smaller scales vanish in the limit of distances approaching zero. For example, here we have a nice smooth function, and as we zoom in on this point, it becomes closer and closer to its tangent line. But big data is often multi-scale. For example, protein scale causes of human scale diseases. And consider, the Earth is to a human as a human is to a protein. Astronomical models need not include the human scale. We don't need to know the distribution of humanity on Earth in order to study how the Earth orbits the Sun. But we do need all that proteomic information to address what happens at the human scale quite often. We need models, therefore, that allow multiple scales. Yet multiscale is often not locally linear. Features at all scales often does allow continuity, but often does not allow differentiability. For example, here we have a fractal. It's self-similar, which means that there is a pattern that repeats at smaller and smaller scales. So when we zoom in to this continuous everywhere but differentiable nowhere function, our zooming in is just going to show us over and over again that pattern that occurs at multiple scales, with the scales becoming smaller and smaller. In other words, we never zoom in to a straight line. We never zoom in to anything other than something that looks exactly like the thing that we started with. So multiple scales imply huge data sets. Protein activity on the scale of minutes is often due to molecular interactions on the scale of nanoseconds. That's billions of samples a second. Twitter viral trends that last for days are due to tweets being sent mere seconds apart, which means we need a lot of tweets. That is, big data is large and complex, and often because the data is produced by a multi-scale complex process and multiple scales require extensive amounts of data. For example, ChatGPT. See, ChatGPT knows the importance of scale. It knows the correct spelling of incomprehensibility, and it can write novels, and everything in between, from letters to books. Its success is in distilling responses from its incredibly large training set, the entire internet, the Library of Congress, on and on. It's a data set that's sampled at the scale of letters, tokens, each token represented by a vector in R to some very large dimension, after which much of what it does is just linear algebra. See, ChatGPT uses words to build documents, tokens, into complex structures, a complex assembly of samples from many sources. Version 3.5 was trained on data up to the year 2021. And we asked it, or in an earlier video, what is data science? And it gave us a reply. So here's the reply that it gave, and I'm not going to belabor this. What I actually want to show you here is that as this reply was formed, it was formed with this enumerated list. This one. And that looks an awful lot like this list. This is one of the sources. So the answer was a complex restructuring of source information. It's not original, it's not thought, but it is multi-scale. So data science is not just statistics. Complexity means we don't even know which questions to ask. It requires a problem-solving approach, such as Polya's method, which is our choice. In 1945, George Polya wrote a book called How to Solve It, based on developing strategies for each step of the problem-solving process. And the key here is developing strategy. So here's Polya's method. These 4 steps are obvious. The 4 steps themselves are not Polya's method. Polya's contribution was to define and develop strategies for each step. And here they are in a data science interpretation. Exploration, which takes us from understanding the problem to devising a plan. Representation, which takes us from the plan to the ability to carry out the plan. Computation, which carries out the plan to the point that we can assess, evaluate, revise. And then interpretation, which we use to understand what it was we produced and therefore maybe revise the problem and do this cycle again. For example, we'll see a quick example in the next video. In Module 2, we'll look at exploration. In Module 3, representation. We'll be doing computation throughout the course, and in Module 4, interpretation. So in summary, big data is multi-scale because emergence is a key issue, but to study it we need very large data sets, enough variety to allow emergent behaviors, and algorithms fast enough to produce answers. And we'll need to use a problem-solving strategy to address the multi-scale complex nature of big data. In the next video, we'll look at the importance of scale in large language models. We'll see an application of the ideas here.